I don't want to be name dropper, but what do you think Khrushchev did to Malenkov? What do you think Stalin did to Trotsky?
Is everybody in this world corrupt?
I don't know everybody.
Maybe we should liquidate the whole human race and start all over again.
Look at it this way, kid. Any world that can produce the Taj Mahal, William Shakespeare, and striped toothpaste can't be all bad.
Welcome to Season 5 of How Would Lubitsch Do It, a podcast in which we discuss the works of director Ernst Lubitsch, one film at a time. It's 1961, and Noah Isenberg joins us to discuss Billy Wilder's 1, 2, 3. Come visit ernstcast.com if you'd like show notes, resources as to where you might find the films we'll be discussing, a link to our Discord, or just to say hi. Welcome, everyone. We are covering a film and a director whose career long outlasted Ernst Lubitsch's life. And this is our episode on Billy Wilder, and in particular, the 1961 film 1, 2, 3. And I want to introduce it and Wilder by talking actually about myself uncharacteristically, because I am a cynic. I would say I'm a slight misanthrope in life. My opinion of the human race is not sterling sometimes in my downer days. And with that said, the film 1, 2, 3 is one of the most cynical pieces of art I've ever seen in my life. And that's part of why I love it so much. Willa, who is often a co-host on this show, described 1, 2, 3 once as beautiful in the sense that it is a great artist sincerely expressing their worldview, in this case through extremely cynical political satire. So part of what I want to get through in this episode is, how did Billy Wilder become the cynic he is? And to do that, we have here Noah Isenberg. Welcome to the show, Noah. And can you give us a little rundown? Who are you and what do you do? And what's your association with Mr. Wilder?
Well, thanks, Devin. It's good to be here today with you and talking about Billy Wilder and 1, 2, 3, one of his less appreciated films, or at least less widely discussed in his very illustrious repertoire. I am a professor at the University of Texas at Austin. I spent the last half decade serving as chair of the Department of Radio, Television, Film here in Austin. And I've now embarked upon a new journey as the Associate Dean for Professional Programs, where I serve simultaneously as the Executive Director of our two study away programs, one in Los Angeles, UTLA, and the other one in New York, UTNY. I have long admired the career of Billy Wilder since my days as a graduate student at the University of California, Berkeley, some 3 decades ago. And it was just less than a handful of years ago when I decided, with the help of my trusty translator friend, Shelley Frisch, to go back to Wilder's writings as a young journalist. Wilder was born in the sticks. He was born in the provinces, in the outer reaches of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in Galicia, in the town of Sucha. But as a young boy, came to Vienna. And it was in Vienna that he began his career as a journalist. And then in the summer of 1926, followed American big band, jazz band leader Paul Whiteman and his orchestra on the next leg of their European tour onward to Berlin. And that's where he then remained for the next 7 years. So it was maybe, 3 years ago or so, 4 years ago, that Shelley and I were given the opportunity from Princeton University Press to put together this volume called Billy Wilder on Assignment, Dispatches from Weimar, Berlin and Interwar, Vienna, that appeared from Princeton in 2021. What is that? It's only 2 years ago. And then in paperback just in 2022. So I guess we are in 2024. I'm having trouble counting.
Takes me a few weeks to acclimatize every year.
I've lost the ability to do very simple arithmetic. I pin it all on the pandemic. That's my go-to. So that's my connection. I'm also now currently doing my darndest to finish up a book, a cultural history of the great American sex comedy, Some Like It Hot. And last but not least, this is the sort of last connection to Wilder, last obligation, you might say, is I'm commissioned to write a short interpretive biography of Billy Wilder for the Yale Jewish Lives series. That will be my last assignment. Who knows? There may be others after that, but I sometimes jokingly refer to this period in my career as a film scholar as Wilder Three Ways, which sounds almost like a kinky Wilder title. It's either that or my wife sometimes says, these are my Wilder years.
Welcome, and thanks so much, as usual, for making time for this. I'm always amazed at how many extraordinarily overqualified people want to hop on a random Canadian show about Ernst Lubitsch to talk about people who aren't Ernst Lubitsch. Wilder, though, is particularly relevant. For starters, the obvious thing is he co-wrote, along with Charles Brackett, who was Wilder's longtime writing partner, two of Ernst Lubitsch's movies, Ninotchka and Bluebeard's Eighth Wife, one of those being much higher profile than the other. this brings us to the beginning of Wilder's life. They share many parallels in terms of their journey. They both started their careers as filmmakers in Berlin, although I think Wilder, being a decade younger, very different context, and that'll really come into play in the 30s. Filmmaking was not his first career. I mean, I guess his first career was as a pool shark and then as a reporter. So I'd love to start at the beginning. What was Billy Wilder's early life like? What were his first vocations? What was his disposition like?
As I was mentioning moments ago, when I wanted to refer to Vienna as his native Vienna, I had to correct myself because, like a lot of filmmakers, including Edgar G. Ulmer, with whom he would collaborate, as well as the Siodmak brothers and Fred Zinnemann, they'd all get together in the summer of 1929 to make Menschen am Sonntag, People on Sunday, one of the most beautiful late silent films of the era. They all would claim to have been Viennese. And actually, I should say Zinnemann, Ulmer, and Wilder. Preminger does the same thing. Otto Preminger, who had nothing to do with Menschen am Sonntag, but another sort of a Landsmann, so to speak, of them, a compatriot. They all claimed to be Viennese because Vienna had that cultural cachet. But all of them were born in the provinces. In Ulmer's case, in Olomouc, in what's today the Czech Republic. In Wilder's case, in Sucha, what today is Poland. He was born in the summer of 1905. His father ran a string of railway cafes. This was on the Vienna to Lemberg line, a string of railway cafes, and then also a hotel in Poland. And it was the hotel in Krakow. That's where young Billy, who was born Samuel or Shmuel, his mother liked to refer to him as Billy because she had gone, as the story goes, to the Buffalo Bill touring show when she was living in New York City with a jeweler uncle of hers on Madison Avenue, and quite likely saw the show at Madison Square Garden. We will never have that corroborated, but that is indeed the story. And she took to calling her second son Billy. Her first, Wilhelm, was referred to as Willy. So you had Willy and Billy. It was in the hotel in Krakow that young Billy, who was hyperactive and who really had trouble kind of keeping full attention, always on a hurry, always on the move. That's where he developed his skills as the pool shark, as you, Devin, referred to moments ago. He would snooker unsuspecting adults in pool and also was known to swipe the tips off of tables at the hotel. There was something that was really quite impish about young Billy. And I think that mischievous, that impish character is something that you can see in a lot of the characters that he then would bring to the screen. First in Weimar, Berlin, when he began, while he was simultaneously filing freelance pieces as a stringer, as a young cub reporter, he began to craft screenplays starting out with Menschen am Sonntag, then Der Rasende Reporter. Excuse me, not Der Rasende, Der Teufelsreporter, which is the Devil's Reporter, hell of a reporter. It's given both titles in the English, starring Eddie Polo, an American actor who very much is sort of an alter ego to the screenwriter himself, a hard-boiled reporter. And Billy, in the collection that I referenced moments ago and that you've had the opportunity to read, Billy Wilder on Assignment, there's a photograph of him doing a cameo where he's also in trench coat and snap brim hat and doing everything he can to exude the hard-boiled quality of an American-style reporter. And to return to his moniker, to being called Billy, and it was spelled in Europe, it was Billie. He then realized that that was normally the way that a woman would spell Billy. In the States, took to spelling it in the conventional Billy. The name alone, and Eugenia, who was very much under the spell of all things American, and something that I think that she really transmitted to her second son. This is something that Ed Sikov makes a point of arguing in his critical biography, Sunset Boulevard, The Life and Times of Billy Wilder. He says that Wilder was really her American son. And from the very, very beginning, I think there is this eye toward the New World and toward America specifically. Even when he first took his job as a cub reporter writing for the two main tabloids, Interwar, Vienna, writing for Die Stunde, the Hour, and Die Bühne, the stage, the first job that he really wanted, he wanted to be a foreign correspondent. He wanted to go to the States, and he had no skills whatsoever in the English language, so that was immediately scrapped. But I think that the desire to make his way across the Atlantic was something that was already kind of percolating inside of him from a very, very young age. And this, I think, explains some of his initial passions, including, first and foremost, his passion for American jazz, big band jazz. And it's Paul Whiteman and his encounter with Paul Whiteman in Vienna that really leads to Weimar, Berlin, and from Berlin on to Paris, and Paris to the U.S.
Throughout Sikov's book, which I highly recommend to anyone interested in looking into Wilder more, it's terrific. What immediately jumped out at me about Wilder was his ability to shapeshift his own identity and his own place to fit into whatever society he either was in or wanted to be in. Like you mentioned, Whiteman, a jazz performer. Billy Wilder is a reporter in Vienna, and he briefly, essentially, frames himself as a PR man
right.
for this jazz star, so he can essentially get a ticket to Berlin, at which point he eventually kind of converts reverts back to a reporter before moving on to his next vocation, which is as a screenwriter and sometime director, eventually one day a full-time director.
Yeah, the press agent's kind of key. That notion of being sort of a PR guy is really important. And I think Billy Wilder had no hand in Sweet Smell of Success, but Tony Curtis's role as Sidney Falco is very much a kind of Wilder character. And of course, Tony Curtis would then be cast in Some Like It Hot to play Joe and Josephine. But I think that there is this sort of press agent quality to some of the initial pieces that Wilder wrote for two major tabloids in Vienna, and then later for the Berliner Zeitung am Mittag, which is the main newspaper he contributed to several, but that was the main newspaper he wrote for in Berlin. This is part of the big Ullstein publishing concern in Weimar, Berlin. It was one of their major newspapers. One of the reasons that it opens up the anthology that I put together with translator Shelley Frisch is the piece where he serves as what we used to call, I think, a taxi dancer, but it's an Eintänzer in German. It's a dancer for hire. And there too, he's not exactly a press agent, but he's writing in a way that it's very self-conscious. It's very witty. You used the term, Devin, when you were talking, and there are certainly people, including Joseph McBride, his most recent biography of Wilder, who would take issue with it. I'm kind of agnostic on the question, and that is branding him a cynic. Joseph McBride takes great pains to portray Wilder much more as a romantic than a cynic. I see both sides of Wilder. And look, when we get to talking about 1, 2, 3, I mean, there's definitely a very, very cynical take on denazification of Germany, on the role that capital, or Coca-Cola capitalism, to be more precise, plays across the globe. Cynical take on sort of Soviet ideology and the ease with which some are willing to shed that garb for capitalism. And look, in a way, I'm not suggesting that Wilder was politically prophetic, but in a way, he's already anticipating certain developments that would take place in Europe a good 2.5 decades later. But I think that Wilder's work as a journalist is absolutely key to understanding what he would later go on to do as a screenwriter. And back to the PR piece, that's such a press agent, the first major picture that he was involved in, and sort of dashed off ideas on scraps of paper, napkins, as the story goes, at the Romanticism Café, which was a very, very popular cafe on Kurfürstendamm, the sort of the Champs-Élysées of Berlin, where lots of journalists and writers and dancers and artists and musicians would gather. That work that he did, Menschen am Sonntag, People on Sunday again, which is it's such an important film for me as a scholar, but I think it's also just next to maybe Murnau's Sunrise is really one of the most beautiful silent films, at least for my money, especially from the German-speaking Middle European world. It's for that particular picture that he ends up not just writing the screenplay, if you can refer to it as a screenplay. Again, it was very much improvised, very, kind of blending documentary and avant-garde aesthetics, and very much in anticipation of what would be done in the name of the Nouvelle Vague and even the Italian neorealism, and later Dogma 95, very low budget, using non-actors, et cetera, et cetera. But the point that I'm trying to make is that while he's doing that, he's writing these like PR pieces, the kind of pieces that you would get in a press kit, essentially, for the film and publishing. He publishes 2 pieces on Mention of Some, just talking about the radical nature of this whole enterprise, that these are sort of untested actors, untested film crew. And instead of doing another glossy confection that were being hatched by the day in UFA Studio, the leading Weimar era studio, instead they're going to kind of turn their back on it and do something completely different. I mean, you don't have handheld shots, but you've got some beautiful photography by Eugen Schriftan, who is the great cameraman. He was really the only veteran film professional on the set, having begun his career as a cameraman working on such storied productions as Fritz Lang's Metropolis. In 1927, he developed what was called the Schriftan process at that time, which is sort of using mirrors and miniatures in order to project much, much larger scale. There are the scenes in Menschen am Sonntag that are just really, really, I find absolutely exquisite when you have this sort of still freeze-frame photography on the beach, which is very much in keeping with a kind of aesthetic of new objectivity, the Neue Sachlichkeit, and such portrait photographers as August Sander and others. The film is really, I think, a great key for understanding the later careers of those who were involved, including, I wrote a critical biography of Edgar G. Ulmer, who was credited as the co-director of the film together with Robert Siodmak. And this is a film that kind of launches the American careers of all who are involved. Ulmer will travel much more in the sort of subterranean depths of B-movie production, doesn't find his way to Paramount. He dreams of a career at Paramount. He writes to his wife about his hopes and dreams of a career at Paramount. Wilder actually aces his way into a long-term contract at Paramount, working with Charlie Brackett, whom you mentioned moments ago, who, yes, together with Charles Brackett, was one of his long-term American writing partners. Brackett and Wilder co-wrote Bluebeard's Eighth Wife, as well as Ninotchka. That's in a way kind of connects him in a very concrete sense to Lubitsch, but he was already enamored of Lubitsch even before leaving Europe. Wilder had seen Lubitsch's work, the silence that he made while still a young man, in this case, Wilder, a young man, and Lubitsch older, but not much older, and really just saw, again, in sort of looking already across the Atlantic to the United States, saw this career that Lubitsch had managed to achieve, taking him from Weimar, Berlin, and arriving in Hollywood with contract and launching this extraordinary career in the United States. More important, perhaps, is the sensibility and the style of Lubitsch, who is known, very elusive, the elusive Lubitsch touch. Can you really define it? I'm not exactly sure, but what you can say is there's a kind of subtle and sly approach to romance and sex. And Wilder, from the very, very beginning, is intensely preoccupied with the notion, exploring the lengths to which human beings will go for both sex and money. These are recurrent themes for Lubitsch, and I think that Wilder really admired, again, the subtlety with which Lubitsch handles those themes that are, especially given American puritanical morality, are really hot button topics, whether it's sort of venal money worship or even more so, sex or any suggestion of sex. And so Wilder was definitely drawn to Lubitsch. Wilder gave many, many, many interviews over the course of his career, and especially late in life. And one of the recurrent comments he makes on Lubitsch is that Lubitsch could do much more with a closed door than current directors could do with an open fly. Basically, in other words, you close that door and then it's left to your imagination what's actually transpiring in that world. If I can just link this back up to the early days of Billy Wilder as a youth in Vienna, his gymnasium, so his high school, was directly next door to the Hotel Stadion, it was called. It was one of those tawdry hotels by the hour. And he was said to have often perched himself up against the window and looked at customers going in and out of that hotel and sort of imagining what the kinds of transactions that were taking place in that hotel. The themes, whether Wilder is working in caustic and frolicsome comedy like 1, 2, 3, or whether he's directing noirs a la Double Indemnity or Sunset Boulevard, he's always dealing with sex and money on some level. Again, to kind of return, Devin, to your notion of Wilder as cynic, I think you can see some cynicism for sure, but there's definitely more to Wilder than just a cynic. And in fact, he was taken to task for being overly cynical in a number of critical instances during his career, starting with Ace in the Hole, Kirk Douglas playing a hard-boiled reporter, very much, again, modeled, I think, on Wilder's experiences working as a reporter, and the just unrelenting indictment of America's bottomless appetite for sensation and for essentially the kind of tabloid journalism that would many, many years later bring us his orangeness, would bring us Trump years. And that may seem like a giant leap, but I think that what Wilder was dealing with in Ace in the Hole is what Americans are willing to believe and willing to do in order, in the case of Kirk Douglas's character, Chuck Tatum, plays the character of Chuck Tatum in Ace in the Hole, what someone is willing to do to sell a good story. That was just far too cynical, far too brutal in many respects for audiences at the time. The other one is when he has Kim Novak playing a prostitute. In the case of Kiss Me Stupid, again, audiences just weren't ready for somebody who, in the name of Billy Wilder, was so willing and happy, and there's a kind of almost a devilish glee with which he would push that envelope on censorship, on puritanical morality. And in Kiss Me Stupid, a lot of audiences, they just weren't ready for it. They weren't ready for it. In other words, his handling of adultery in that film, the characterization in particular of Kim Novak. You were speaking moments ago, Devin, about Wilder and his, I can't remember how you put it, but his kind of swapping of identities, shape-shifting, I think you said, yeah.
Yes, he was able to mold his identity to kind of fit whatever context he was in, which I know caused him some grief later on during the war when he was torn between being a well-behaved immigrant and doing more to fight the Nazis from afar.
Right, absolutely. Masquerade, role play, swapping of identities. And this harkens back to his directorial debut, The Major and the Minor, with Ginger Rogers and Ray Milland, where Ginger Rogers needs to pose as and it's really, today, I'm not sure how a film like this would fly, but in order to get a discounted ticket from New York City, where she's been trying her hand, frustratingly, as a scalp masseuse, but to get a discounted ticket back to her native Iowa, she has to pose as a minor. Basically, from that film onward, you have so many instances of role play masquerade, cross-dressing, if you like, not just in Some Like It Hot, most famously, but even in Stalag 17. You mentioned Wilder's unwillingness to just allow pieties to exist. Instead, it's always about how do you poke holes at the holy cows. And in this particular case of Stalag 17, you have not only the deliciously wicked parody of a camp commandant, in the case of Otto von Scherbach, played by Otto Preminger, a Jewish emigre just like Wilder, and there's something also that's kind of crass when you think about having him play. Wilder was not unique in this regard at that time because of the accent, because of their familiarity with Nazi violence and demeanor of Nazi officers, you had a number of German-speaking Middle European Jewish emigres in Hollywood who were cast to play in these roles. But in that particular character, again, really kind of applying pressure, and not just pressure, but in a very caustic and kind of comedic vein, at a time when, sure, there was all sorts of uproar when Mel Brooks brought up the producers, but this predates the producers by a good decade plus, and just the unwillingness to stick to a kind of doctrinaire script of re-education, denazification. Instead, it's playful, and you've got, again, to come back to the sort of role play and cross-dressing, you have Animal's obsession with Betty Grable, and then Shapiro, who dresses as Betty Grable in this kind of otherwise just silly scene, but I think an important scene as well in understanding Wilder's desire to kind of poke fun at essentially anything and everything. He traveled back to Germany immediately after the war. His mother, his stepfather, and his maternal grandmother, they would all perish in the camps, but he returned in 1945 in U.S. service uniform to work on the production of Hanush Berger's film, Die Todesmühlen, The Death Mills. You can stream it on YouTube, The Death Mills. That is precisely what he's working against in a weird way. I mean, at the time he was brought in as, I think it was technical supervisor, I believe was the credit he received on it, but he works with Hanush Berger, a Czech immigrant filmmaker, on this film. And this is a film that's aimed at re-education. It's aimed at denazifying the population and re-educating them, instructing them in a very, very heavy-handed way, you might even say with a bludgeon, on what had occurred in their backyards, making them aware of these atrocities. You know the film?
Oh, yeah. It's kind of interesting that there's so many versions of this film because the same footage was used in the Soviet version, Auschwitz, and it was reused again in I think it was only finished like a decade ago, the German concentration camps factual survey. So it's interesting that this kind of same pile of footage has Alfred Hitchcock's name on it. Death Mills is kind of this funny middle one for me. That's kind of the order I watch them in, at least. But it's fascinating. I know that the actual authorship of Death Mills, there's a lot of contradictory info on that.
Yeah.
As to, whether Wilder even had much to do with it, right?
It's unclear. That's why I was a little careful in trying to give the credit, the official credit I think that he received as a technical advisor. He was part of a group of emigre film professionals who were brought back to Germany to try to help with this program of re-education and denazification. What's interesting is that from the very beginning, right, meaning once he gets back to Hollywood and starts making movies again, you have a foreign affair. And a foreign affair has a real connection, I think, to 1, 2, 3 in the sense that there you have, and you can think about that opening shot with the plane arriving in a ruinous Berlin, a Berlin that's just sort of mountains of ruins from the Allied air war, and that plane descending upon Berlin. I don't know how your familiarity with Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will, but in a way it's just a direct citation of Hitler's plane arriving at the Nuremberg party rallies in 1934 in Leni Riefenstahl's quasi-documentary.
It feels like a response.
Yeah, no doubt. But instead of treating these themes with sanctimonious, more self-righteous, instead, what does he do? Same as in 1, 2, 3, pokes and prods at every prevailing ideology. And this begins in the dialogue in that airplane where, you have the one congressman who's advocating turning Germany into the sort of the Morgenthau plan, essentially. They're turning Germany into this agrarian nation, not allowing for any rebuilding and so forth. You then have the dialogue with the New York congressman who's talking about bread and giving them bread. You can't leave the label on. You leave the label on, you're dealing with imperialism. It's just sort of rapid fire dialogue in the airplane. But again, it gives Wilder the chance to approach ideology with tongue in cheek. And again, not in any way buying into a single ideology, but rather looking at each one refracted through, I think you might say, a more cynical lens, or at least a very critical lens and a comedic lens. And that's certainly true of A Foreign Affair and the way that he handles this, again, half-hearted denazification, something you see crop up in 1, 2, 3 for sure, in terms of Schlemmer and these other characters who Captain Renault would say in Casablanca. It depends on what the prevailing wind and where the wind's coming from. The prevailing wind happens to be coming from Vichy. In Casablanca, in this case, the prevailing wind happens to be coming from Coca-Cola capitalism in 1, 2, 3. But in each case, Wilder is definitely applying pressure and dealing with these otherwise very serious ideological questions, dealing with them in a very comedic and kind of sarcastic, or again, to return to your term, more cynical vein.
One, I think, crucial bit of background here is the manner in which Wilder left Germany, right? He didn't leave Germany like Lubitsch did as a triumphant international filmmaker getting a job in Hollywood. No, he left Germany as a refugee. Stopped over in Paris briefly. He had a lot of foresight, it seems. So he left for New York, then Hollywood. And I think that's important here because I actually only recently in the past month watched Stalag 17, which kind of fills in a gap between A Foreign Affair and 1, 2, 3, because all three to me are really dealing with Wilder's evolving relationship with Germany. I know that as of A Foreign Affair, he at least, this might be apocryphal because everything about Wilder is apocryphal. We haven't mentioned this before, but he is a noted fabulist. He lies about everything or comes up with wonderful fables usually about everything. His life story is very fantastical and interesting.
If I could just interject here, Devin, briefly, because I think it's very important along this question of mendacity, truth and fiction, and what's a lie, what's not. One of the most beautiful pieces in this collection, I think, is called The Art of Little Ruses, which basically, The Art of Little Ruses is a piece that Wilder wrote as a 20-something, as a journalist, about the virtues of mendacity, about learning one ought to be taught how to lie in school, because that's really what's going to be your ticket to fame and fortune. That's what's your to success, at least, if not fame and fortune.
It certainly worked.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think you're onto something here. I think that in terms of what I would call sort of
mythologization.
I think that might be it. But anyway, the construction of a new identity for oneself, again, that's, as you put it, that's based on place, context, where one is. I think that that's a lesson that someone like Wilder learned very early. It's not unique to Wilder. I mean, Edgar Ulmer, again, with whom he collaborated on People on Set, was known as the greatest liar in Hollywood. That was one of his many moniker. I think it was actually Lotte Eisner who wrote one of the two most important books on Weimar cinema, German cinema between the wars, called The Haunted Screen. I think she referred to him as the greatest liar in the history of motion pictures. But Wilder, too, they recognized the need for self-reinvention. And that self-reinvention, so you need to take a little bit of poetic license, big deal. If it makes for a better story, what's to criticize? For me, another touchstone and a key moment for Wilder is the story that he told when he received the Irving Thalberg Award for finest production as a filmmaker and writer late in life, essentially a Lifetime Achievement Award. And he tells the story. So he arrives in America after spending a little less than a year in Paris at the Hotel Ansonia, where a bunch of refugees, including Friedrich Holländer, with whom he'd collaborated, the great composer from The Blue Angel, and then he actually appears in A Foreign Affair at the piano.
He's in 1, 2, 3 as well. He's the band leader.
Exactly, and then as the band leader, as the torches are being thrown, but he was holed up at that same hotel, Hotel Ansonia. Wilder arrives with a short-term contract from Colombia. They provided an affidavit, at least for those purposes, but he needs to cross the border into Mexico in order to renew his visa because that expired, a 6-month contract and a 6-month visa. So he crosses the border and he tells the story, a story that he then would put on the page when writing the script for Mitchell License, Hold Back the Dawn. But he tells the story how he's just languishing in this Mexican border town of Mexicali. And he tells the story of how he's finally called up to go and speak with a consular official and see about securing that visa that he needs in order to make his way back to the United States. He had to leave in a hurry. You mentioned this. He didn't have the good fortune of Lubitsch arriving in the U.S. when his career was on the rise. Wilder, by contrast, was still very much in the process of establishing a career.
Yeah, he was a total unknown in Hollywood.
Absolutely. By the way, it was people like Lubitsch who helped to bring the stranded European refugees to the United States by paying into, this was a fund that he helped to establish together with Paul Kohner, the famous agent.
Dietrich was involved with that too, right?
Dietrich paid into this as well. And Salka Viertel, who wrote this wonderful Hollywood memoir called The Kindness of Strangers, the New York Review of Books Classics just recently reissued, with a lovely afterword by Donna Rifkin, who wrote a whole biography of Salka Viertel that came out just a couple of years ago. And it was called the European Film Fund. So that's a bit later. Wilder was already in the U.S., but I just want to make the point that Lubitsch was very active in helping out people who were at sort of Wilder's stage in their career, or in certain instances, they just happen to be writers and they need to help them get out of Nazi-engulfed Europe. And so they would provide affidavits and short-term contracts, kind of like what Wilder received. But this was before the European Film Fund had been established, 1938.
Is the story you're referring to the one about the border guard?
Thank you. Absolutely. Yeah, sorry, I got a little bit astray in trying to flesh things out with Lubitsch and Lubitsch's involvement with Kohner and Salka Viertel, et cetera, et cetera. But yes, it's at the border official. He's finally called up. He had to leave in a hurry. He left behind all sorts of important documents. And so he doesn't have what he needs, or at least that's what he believes. So he's sweating and worrying and pacing. And he was a lifelong pacer and a veteran pacer. And he gets to this border guard who he says had an uncanny resemblance to Will Rogers. And he looks at him and he says, "So what is it that you do for your profession, Mr. Wilde?" He says, "I'm a writer. I write for the movies." And at that moment, the border official takes a big pregnant pause, deep breath, stamps his passport twice and says, "Write some good ones." Again, this may be just as apocryphal as some of the other wonderful stories that have been embroidered by Wilder himself and by scholars and writers like me in the meantime. But I do think there's something to this story, not only in terms of how it then gets respun in his screenplay for Hold Back the Dawn, the Mitchell Lyson picture a few years later, but also how Wilder continues to play with that narrative thread, the thread of reinvention, of ambition that sometimes involves a total makeover, so to speak, that kind of thing. And so if we're going to try to find certain through lines or narrative strands that are woven into Wilder's work, I think that's definitely another critical strand. And this enormous faith in the New World, and again, in North America, or the US in this case, that is a place where one can reinvent oneself.
So now to take us from his feelings about his new home to his feelings about his old home, let's talk about A Foreign Affair. Because while he was visiting Berlin for the first time since the war, according to Wilder, he felt a great sense of anger, betrayal, and Foreign Affair to me feels very like a film that's at war with itself in certain ways.
Oh, yeah.
Where it feels like driven by competing impulses of wanting reconciliation and also of a sense of collective guilt of the Dietrich character in that movie who was married to a Nazi. The film authorially seems to see as somewhat culpable, but also maybe worth saving. It kind of lets her off the hook at the end in a funny way where she gets taken away to some sort of comeuppance by the authorities, but you kind of get the sense she's going to get away. You know, she's going to...
Sure. She's the consummate survivor, and survivor not in the Shoah Holocaust sense of survivor in the sense of a political opportunist. Again, more like a Captain Renault figure in Casablanca. Wherever that prevailing wind is coming from, she's going to be right there and have it in her sails at her back. Erika von Schlütau, that's her character's name in A Foreign Affair, is in many ways, I think, a stand-in for the director. Not only her as a chanson singer and singing about the selling illusions, which is what else does a filmmaker do other than sell illusions, but also that kind of wrestling with the ghosts of the past. And I think that you're right about the anger, about the feeling of betrayal. But again, because it's Wilder, and he said this too again in interviews, he would say when he was incredibly depressed, he made comedies, and he was very, very happy. Then he made dramas and much more serious and somber films. He had to have been enormously depressed after learning about the deaths of his mother, stepfather, grandmother, and other extended family. He told this to Volker Schlundorf in the 3-hour documentary that he made of Wilder. Billy Wilder Talks, I think is the way it was released, but that was in a much condensed version. But in any case, in those conversations with the contemporary German filmmaker Volker Schlundorf, he says that those years in Berlin were the happiest years of his life. And so to return after the war, still reeling from the Holocaust and learning of all these extraordinary numbers of deaths and atrocities and so forth, but also thinking about what he'd experienced in that city when he last left it. I mean, it's got to be, trauma doesn't even begin to describe, I think, what he must have felt.
There's a strange sense of nostalgia in that movie for the city that used to be.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a constant awareness of this isn't just the hated home of the Nazis. This was a great place full of people that the director loved, and a lot of whom are dead.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. You're so right here, Devin. And that's why Erika von Schlütau is a key figure here of Marlene Dietrich's character, because she's tapping into the old Berlin, not only in performing a role that almost channels the spirit of Lola Lola that she played in von Sternberg's Blue Angel, her breakout performance during the late Weimar years.
And that's essentially still Dietrich playing to a certain degree herself.
Absolutely.
That was what she did in real life.
And they were dear, dear friends. And that's why I do think, I don't want to overstate the point, but I do think to a large degree, Dietrich is sort of performing the role of the director there. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a thick veneer of nostalgia, but it's there, and it crops up in certain moments, and in particular, the nightclub scenes.
Yeah.
The nightclub scenes are an unmistakable reminder of what once was in Berlin. And also, by the way, I don't mean to suggest that that's all that Weimar Berlin, because that's the mythologies that we traffic in motion pictures, in literature, and even in reporting in the case of Wilder. That's one of the images that Weimar Berlin, for better or for worse, will always be remembered. The image of a certain social and sexual libertine kind of moment, a moment of freedom. These were the heady days of possibility where Berlin really felt like this great, in many respects it was, hotbed of progressivism, a kind of open-mindedness and a broad-mindedness even at a time when elsewhere that was not the case at all, and definitely not the case in the United States. This is before the Hays Code goes into effect, but the Catholic Legion of Decency is beginning to clamp down on motion pictures already in the years leading up up to the enforcement of the Hays Code in summer 34. For Wilder, again, if we are to take his assertion in conversation with Volker Schlendorf to heart, that these were the happiest days of his life, there was this sense of not just youthful play and possibility, but also it would be impossible, I think, for Wilder not to imagine what Berlin could have become instead of what it became. And those two are so incongruous. Talk about polar opposites. I mean, with the gauntlet of National Socialism and the destruction not only of that precious world that Wilder so adored and appreciated, but also everything that it represented. And this is why I think, again, if we go from A Foreign Affair to Stalag 17 to 123, there's the playful nature of how he addresses whether it's a POW camp in Stalag 17, whether it's the black market, the underworld of Berlin in A Foreign Affair, or whether it's the tango that's danced in 123 when it comes to capitalism and a kind of crude Marxism.
And the ex-Nazis, I think, are an important element there.
Absolutely. But all of them kind of this potent cocktail that Wilder serves up in 123.
The arc is interesting because I think this is where I can kind of start dealing directly with 123 because Stalag 17, I was quite taken aback by the superhuman character in that. He plays the assistant to the commandant. He's the Nazi in charge. He's kind of the capo, right? He's keeping order. And he's both a lovable character in some strange ways. He's superhuman. You can't help but kind of find him jolly, but he's terrifying. And the mechanics of his character are fascinating because he hides his evil, his Machiavellian way of retaining control with that kind of veneer of joviality and just like, oh, I'm this German fool. And then by the time you get to 123, which is, made 8 years later, Sigruman actually does appear kind of in a voice role. And he's back to being this just complete disempowered fool.
Just because I'm reduced to earning my living in a washroom does not mean that I'm willing to peddle the honor and dignity of my family name. The von Droste-Schattenboys date back to the Second Crusade. We have one of the oldest bloodlines in Europe and one of the most inbred. So your proposition is not only preposterous, it is highly insulting. Make it $10,000.
At that point, the Nazis are this punchline, but a punchline with bite. By the time you get to 123, right? You have the hilarious jokes in this film about all the ways, essentially, that the American occupiers tolerate and take advantage of the presence and pre-existing systems that these ex-Nazis have built. So you get these constant, the yawal, the clicking of the heels, and it's all incredibly funny at that point. So it almost feels like this is the moment when Wilder achieved enough distance to it so he could properly skewer it without having any need to take it remotely seriously, even though in a weird way it does.
Yeah, no, I'm trying to think if you follow that line from Stalag 17 to 123. In Stalag 17, we're almost back at Lubitsch's to be or not to be in certain respects. Hannah Arendt spoke of the banality of evil and the figure of Eichmann. With Wilder and taking the lead of his great mentor, Lubitsch, it's the hilarity of evil in a way. I mean, a buffoonery of evil, if you like. And I think, sure, in Sigruman, he plays Schultz, right? The Sigruman character.
Yeah, in Stalag 17, he plays Schultz, which I love as a reference because in To Be or Not to Be, obviously, his character is constantly berating his assistant named Schultz. So now he gets to be Schultz.
Schultz! Screaming.
Yeah.
But in both cases, it would take us a good amount of time, I think, to tease this all out. But I think that there is, in To Be or Not to Be, the illusory nature of spectacle of Nazism is very, very important. The performative nature of Nazism. In Stalag 17, it's a kind of balancing act, it almost seems, between the POWs on the one hand, who are living in this kind of state of ambient anarchy and have a sort of subversive quality, certainly in terms of, and this is one in a series of escape movies that came out around that time. You can think of The Great Escape in addition, in the same vein.
River Kwai as well. Yeah.
Exactly. There was a whole proliferation of POW escape movies. This is different from those others, though, in the sense that I think, again, the dark comedy is so much more palpable and so much more prominent. Then you get to 123, and the Nazis, I mean, in many respects, and that's why I think in A Foreign Affair, too, that dialogue in the airplane, and also just the way that the kind of competing ideologies are handled, again, in a very comical vein, is so important. In 123, the willingness, the ease with which Americans and allies, for that matter, Western allies, but Americans specifically, and Cagney sort of at the helm, will turn a kind of a blind eye to former Nazis who, again, are in positions of power. I'm not suggesting that Wilder was, because that's just not the way that he made movies, that's the way he wrote stories, but it's very much in keeping with Adenauer's approach to the federal public, which was, as long as you you can form a bulwark against the Soviet Union, against the GDR, no problem. You're a Nazi, not a big deal. Let's just make sure that we can maintain supremacy as a capitalist democracy.
So the Americans got the space program.
Yeah. Well, there's a wonderful book that came out in the 1990s by a sociologist and historian by the name of Jeffrey Herf called Divided Memory, and talks about the different ways in which the Holocaust was remembered or not remembered in both sides, so the Federal Republic and the German Democratic, so in other words, West and East Germany. And I think that Wilder, as he does in A Foreign Affair, and as he does to a certain extent as well in his POW comedy, Stalag 17, he's addressing real ideological questions, but doing so in his own, again, maybe indebted to Lubitsch. And I think that it's very important to look at To Be or Not to Be, as well as Ninotchka, which he co-wrote for Lubitsch with Brackett, because you have the Three Stooges, if you like.
The Three Russians, yeah. Ninotchka, I'm glad you brought that up because that's where I want to go next, because this film, I listened to the Michael Schlesinger commentary on the Masters of Cinema release of 1, 2, 3, and he calls this film 1, 2, 3 a testament movie, similar to North by Northwest or Rio Bravo for Hitchcock and Hawks, respectively, in that it almost feels like a greatest hits of Wilder. And Ninotchka has to be the central text here, though, because, like you mentioned, it features the three Bolsheviks. But I think the biggest kinship between the two, 1, 2, 3, I feel like I buried the lead on this. This movie is insane.
Yeah.
It's like Duck Soup or His Girl Friday or Hell's a Pop and all had a baby, and it talks even faster than any of them. But politically, it's so fascinating because, similar to Ninotchka, you have this comparison drawn between capitalism and Soviet communism. But both films end up in, I think, a fundamentally not apolitical, but at a political point that transcends all of those. In Ninotchka, it's about love, right? It's about love and the reason why we live. But in 1, 2, 3, this is where I can bring in the cynicism. 1, 2, 3 is far more cynical than Ninotchka in terms of how we might transcend those politics. 1, 2, 3 is almost, I kind of want to call it apolitical in where it ends up, but that's not true. It's more of throwing up our hands and going, well, might as well make the best of it. We got the Taj Mahal and striped toothpaste.
Right, exactly. I mean, I think Horst Buchholz's character, Otto, is a really good lens on that cynicism. The final scenes of the movie, and again, in terms of the speed and just the extraordinary tempo of the film and the speed with which Cagney, next, which really sort of spits out his lines.
It's athletic. For those listening who haven't seen it, it's downright athletic, his performance in this movie.
First, call Reinhardt and Reinhardt Custom Tailors and have them send up everything they've got in their shop. Single-breasted, 3-button, narrow lapels, medium-graded, dark blue, size 39 regular. Next, call Plesky the haberdasher. I want to see some shirts. Broadcloth, plain or tab collar, size 15.5, 34. Shorts, nylon or cotton, size 32. Socks, French lisle, dark tone, size 11.5. Ties, not too wide, not too narrow, not too fancy. Also pajamas, handkerchiefs, cufflinks, suspenders, etc., etc.
And there's another performance like that. Another Wilder picture is Edward G. Robinson's performance in
Double Indemnity.
In Double Indemnity, as Barton Keyes, when he's rattling off death by train, death by murder, death by... And he said, both these Cagney and Edward G. Robinson, both coming out of the gangster films, the Warner films, these street tough kind of guys. Cagney, much more conservative, and this apparently was on the set. Wilder was famously liberal and didn't really have a conservative bone in his body. And apparently there was a little bit of sparring, I guess, on set between Cagney and Wilder. But the speed with which Cagney belts out those lines, of course, is definitely memorable. But also, we were talking moments ago about the switching of identities, the swapping of identities, the role play, and self-reinvention within a matter of seconds. And here's one of the many instances of cynicism in the film. But this one is, for me, the one that is most prominent and the one that we're left with, is the speed with which he changes from being this upstart Marxist to being, a Coca-Cola executive.
I'm so glad you brought up Otto because his transformation is just unbelievable. It's so nuanced too. I love it where it isn't just that he goes from one to the other. It's that he goes through the entire political gamut, right? He goes from committed Marxist.
Look at all this waste. Capitalism is like a dead herring in the moonlight. It shines, but it stinks.
To complete apathetic, burn it all down.
From now on, I fight alone. It's piffle against everybody and everything.
To quoting Abraham Lincoln.
Maybe our children can make this a better place to live in. A world where men are created equal and there's liberty and justice for all.
Congratulations. You just quoted Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, and the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag.
A what?
At the end, to just being a complete mercenary capitalist.
Now, we must look beyond the 6-pack. Why not a 9-pack?
or 12-pack.
It's Ninochka in Fast Forward.
Mercenary, only time I've ever heard the term used, but I like Coca-Cola capitalist. Maybe they're one and the same, mercenary capitalist and Coca-Cola capitalist. But the thing is here, this is again, I think, Wilder having fun with his audience. And that's maybe why some took umbrage with feeling like they've been duped or whatever in the case of, say, Ace in the Hole, or whether he'd taken things too far and Kiss Me Stupid. But in 1, 2, 3, and this is why I think it's so closely linked to his mentor, Lubitsch, and in particular to Ninochka, and even more so, as I've mentioned before, he had no hand in To Be or Not to Be, but Wilder certainly knew the picture.
Mm-hmm. He was one of the writers who attempted to control Lubitsch into cutting that one line. What he did to Shakespeare, we did to Poland. He was apparently in that room. There's actually a few lines in 1, 2, 3 that I'm like, wow, how did that, like the one about General Sherman's little barbecue, that sort of thing?
She married a communist? This is going to be the biggest thing to hit Atlanta since General Sherman threw that little barbecue.
Little things like that. I'm like, well, okay, so he apparently wasn't above doing that himself.
Not at all. And I'm not going to suggest necessarily that he took that from Lubitsch, but he and Lubitsch both, I think, took considerable pleasure in sneaking lines past the censors and a little wink and a nudge, in jokes, lots and lots of double entendre. And the example you gave, even stuff that's you're like, well, wait a second, was somebody not paying attention when vetting the script?
That's the line that sticks out to me. I don't know how the Sherman line ever got through.
What I was going to try to say about To Be or Not to Be and the final moments of 1, 2, 3 is that once more, we're in this land of make-believe. Of course, it's Hollywood after all. But the performative nature of Nazism in the case of To Be or Not to Be and of capitalism in the case of 1, 2, 3, again, to use the line from Erika von Schlütau singing in the nightclub, the Lorelei in A Foreign Affair, you're selling illusions. In both cases, you're selling illusions. And I think that kind of performative aspect, again, very self-conscious, played for laughs. I mean, there are other more muted affinities. These, I think, are really, really strong affinities between Wilder and his mentor.
This is something I feel like I didn't properly introduce it before, but the degree to which Wilder looked up to Lubitsch is immense. I mean, one need only look at the name of this podcast, which is called How Would Lubitsch Do It?, which is the sign that this podcast got its name from, the sign that hung on Billy Wilder's office wall, designed supposedly by Saul Bass, that said in quite nice cursive, how would Lubitsch do it? By the time we release this episode, I'm getting an Art Deco looking replica made.
If you just use that question, how would Lubitsch do it? Do a Google search or take your preferred search engine. You will find a number of images of that sign, of the sign that very prominently was displayed in Wilder's office just off Sunset Boulevard.
And actually, I happened to stumble upon it in person, actually, at the Berlin Film Museum. So if you ever want to see it, it's in Berlin.
As are Wilder's papers.
Yes.
His whole literary estate is kept at the Deutsche Kinemathek in the Berlin Museum right there at Potsdamer Platz.
Exactly. To me, it's interesting, too, the way that Wilder kind of ingested the influence of Lubitsch. I want to contrast to the way he ingested the influence of Howard Hawks, because Howard Hawks was the director who he shadowed on Ball of Fire as Wilder was transitioning to directing. I find it interesting because when I watched Stalag 17 recently, I thought to myself, this is such a Hawks movie. You know, it's hanging out with a bunch of dudes in a trapped location. It really reminded me of something even like Only Angels Have Wings.
Or even Ball of Fire, especially in the scene when the men are dancing at Christmas.
Yeah.
You could almost see a direct line to Ball of Fire, too.
Exactly. And the Lubitsch influence, and also you can see the Hawks influence in the way he moves his camera, the way he composes shots, it's everywhere. But the Lubitsch influence to me has always been interesting because I think my theory of the case is that sometimes it derails Wilder slightly when he tries to do a Lubitsch. Love in the Afternoon is the film to me when he's most clearly trying to do that. And I struggled with that film because I don't think Wilder has quite that sense of rhythm that Lubitsch had. He has a different sense, one that I think works perfectly for something like 1, 2, 3, which is fast. It's a machine gun of a movie. But I also think that 1, 2, 3 takes in other influences from Lubitsch, like that way of inference, the wordplay, the particular German Middle European sensibility, that ineffable touch. It's there. It's just there as translated by Wilder's much more abrasive style in this movie. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I would agree with you. What I would say, though, about 1, 2, 3 and the connection to Hawks is perhaps the pacing.
Yes.
You referenced bringing up Baby moments ago, and you were saying about how do you come up with 1, 2, 3 and the madcap, zany nature of that film. And I think there is a sort of Hawksian tempo to it. Obviously, there were other filmmakers who were making, especially in the era of screwball comedy, not only did you have fast-talking dames and their male counterparts, but I just think in general, tempo, it's perhaps fitting that one of the newspapers, an illustrated newspaper that Wilder contributed in Weimar, Berlin, was actually called Tempo. And he was known, he took on the moniker of the racing reporter. And so Wilder had an affinity for speed. He liked car races.
Probably a apocryphal story about being arrested in it was a Balkan nation.
Oh, really?
In a new American car that he had. And he gets pulled over and he says, "Oh, I'm sorry. It's one of those new American models. It only drives fast."
I don't think I know that interview, if you can believe it, but I like that one.
It's somewhere in the 700-page Sikov book.
Oh, the Sikov book. Yeah, I'll need to look for that. I've read that thing backwards and forwards, but for some reason, that anecdote, I don't have that one handy. I think there is an affinity in terms of tempo and that kind of anarchic nature that you see, obviously, in a movie like in Bring Up Baby, in His Girl Friday.
I also feel a distinct Marx Brothers influence.
Yeah, you mentioned Duck Soup.
Yeah, and to me, it's no surprise that at some point, Wilder wanted to make a Marx Brothers film until Harpo's death put a kibosh to that. But that is the least surprising news I've ever heard, because to me, the nature, even the editing and the blocking of this film really recalls especially Duck Soup, and that's Leo McCarey, who would have also been an influence. It's this shouty assault. I feel like I'm being yelled at while watching, mostly by Jimmy Cagney, but Arlene Francis gets on the action.
Yeah, it's funny. I think that the affinity there, if I'm continuing to search for affinities, is the anarchic nature of the humor. And there are moments when things, I don't want to suggest necessarily that sort of the wheels fall off the bus. It's also the score, Friedrich Hollander, the compositions for 1, 2, 3, and that frenetic pace, that
the saber dance constantly.
Yeah, right. Again, I think that links to a certain degree to the frenetic pacing of a Marx Brothers film, or even to screwball comedies of Howard Hawks and others, including Leo McCarey. You mentioned him earlier.
Absolutely. It's worth noting the opening lines of the script here, which are a note that says, "This piece must be played molto furioso at a rapid-fire breakneck tempo, suggested speed, 100 miles an hour on the curves, 140 on the straightaway," which that describes it well.
Well, molto furioso, I think, even if used mainly for classical compositions, I think describes this piece in many, many respects. There is something molto furioso about it, not just the pacing. And that's why, you mentioned this too, when we were discussing A Foreign Affair, how when Wilder returned to Berlin and whatever hand he played in Hanush Berger's Die Todesmühlen, the Death Mills, there is this intense anger and frustration and betrayal and all that. But instead of just allowing that to fester, he translates it into humor. And I think that you have that on display as well in 1, 2, 3, in the different ways in which he caustically and deliciously skewers the pieties of Marxism, of capitalism, of Nazism. Not that necessarily was, well, for many people, it was indeed a piety, I guess. But in this particular case, he has a kind of, again, anarchic, furious, anger-driven. I'm not really doing it justice, because if you think of it the way I just misleadingly described it, you might think that it would be very heavy-handed. What Wilder, this again may come from the proverbial touch of his mentor, there's got to be more subtlety to it. It's got to be frothy and light. It can't just be this angry indictment.
I think, too, what really helps the film feel less didactic, I don't think it's didactic at all, but I think what really helps is that everything's a target, right? He goes right at American hypocrisy.
Including the balloons.
Yeah, exactly. He goes right at American hypocrisy the same way he goes at German hypocrisy and Soviet hypocrisy with equal zeal. I mean, to me, the most tiresome critique of the film I see frequently, I say frequently, but the film is underseen in general. But among the people who've seen it, who critique it, the thing that annoys me most is when people call it pro-capitalist. It's made by someone who has been living in that capitalist system for decades. But I think the film is just as cynical about the Coca-Cola company as it is about anything else. No one gets away unscathed. And yet, I think the film does enunciate a very specific worldview. And to kind of loop back to my initial, not accusation, but hinting of the film as cynical, my feeling is really that there's a kind of cheap, edgy cynicism that we often think of when we think of the word cynicism. I don't think the film is that. I think the film's worldview is best expressed by that one famous exchange, right? Is everybody in the world corrupt? Well, I don't know everyone. And then Cagney's response, right? A world that gave us Shakespeare, the Taj Mahal, and straight toothpaste can't be all bad. And to me, that's Billy Wilder. It's an acknowledgement that there's human foibles and I'd say a simultaneous respect for the dignity of people, but also an acceptance that generally people fail to live up to respecting that dignity and a disappointment in that. And now I'm going to make a 2-hour comedy where we yell a lot.
Yeah. You mentioned at the outset the hypocrisy orthodoxy with which each competing faction approaches their ostensible dogma or doctrine that they're following. In a way, it leads me back, and I couldn't resist the temptation. I pull out this collection and return my attention to The Art of Little Ruses, which in many respects I think is kind of an urtext for Wilder. This is a piece that he published in Berlin in May of 1927. And he says here, and I think it really does kind of bring us, this is the rug that ties the dude's room together in The Big Lebowski. Here we go. I'm going to read it for you. I don't want to come right out and insist that starting this very day, schools teach the art of lying, by which I mean using postures and facial expressions, gestures and inflections of the voice to convey the opposite of truth, with sweeping powers of persuasion and achieve smashing success. I don't mean to demand it explicitly in the framework of pushing the latest educational reform, for I too am ensnared in a curiously outdated set of ideas, and I appreciate and honor the so-called truth. But I can easily imagine that in 2 or 3 decades, lies will be regarded as an indispensable and hence utterly unobjectionable implement in our daily lives. And their correct and appropriate use could be learned systematically by employing the scientific method. I'm just going to read one last short paragraph here. He says, the lie as mandatory school subject, accessible to everyone and anyone, a matter entailing assiduous effort and tireless aspiration, would no longer be the privilege of the few who have a natural predisposition in this arena. That, I think, would be the consummate moral and social justification of this hitherto maligned resource on a strictly democratic basis. And so basically, he comes out here as a 22-year-old freelance journalist in a very, very caustic and comedic, witty vein, saying that really we'd better learn the art of mendacity, the art of lying, or else we're just not going to catch up with the future. And even imagines, almost with a certain degree of prescience, that those who do master it, they're the ones who are really going to succeed. This question of hypocrisy or distorting or perverting the truth is something that Wilder was acutely aware of and played with in so much of his writing and his work, even dating back to 1927 when he penned those words.
Oh, I'm so glad you read that because I think that's a key part of the Wilder psyche. He's such an interesting contrast to Lubitsch, who has been my focus for the past couple of years. Not because there's any dichotomy between the two, but because they responded in a psychological way so differently to the world around them. Where Lubitsch, he's defined by this gap between the man he was and the people he portrayed on screen, but he had this kind of fundamental warm character. Everyone around him just seemed to love the guy. Wilder was a pricklier man. He was no Preminger or God forbid, a von Sternberg.
Yeah.
Who everyone around there fully agreed was tiresome. After having read most of the biography, he still feels like a bit of a distant figure to me. Someone who I try and grab onto, but slips away in the sense of, because of that democratic application of the untrue, because of the kind of mist that therefore surrounds so much of his life. I feel at a loss to describe of how he arrived at where he did in even a nature versus nurture sense. It's very tempting to go, wow, his experience as a refugee really gave him a worldview, but no, that's not true. I mean, he was a pool shark as a kid. He was a child thief.
Yeah, you're not mistaken. He was a natural-born entertainer and a natural-born scoundrel at once. I think that was part of the legacy of Mr. Wilder. There's a great, apropos of that, there's another film, we didn't discuss it today, but it's worth revisiting. It's like 1, 2, 3. I think it's one that hasn't really received as much attention as some of Wilder's more famous films like The Apartment and Some Like It Hot and Sunset Boulevard and Double Indemnity. But Fedora, in a way, it's sort of perfect double feature with Sunset Boulevard, sort of like the sequel in certain respects to Sunset Boulevard. But there was a wonderful fictional work that was written by the British novelist and writer Jonathan Coe that came out a couple of years ago called Mr. Wilder and Me. In large measure, it's about the making of Fedora, but it also deals with some of these questions that you've just now been wrestling with, or that we've been wrestling with, Devin, about who was this Mr. Wilder? And then it doesn't necessarily tackle the nature versus nurture question, but it does apply some pressure to understanding this, at times, enigmatic myth. I tend to chalk it up in many instances to play. I think he was just so playful throughout that sometimes you didn't know really where he stood in terms of when I was saying moments ago that he's a natural-born entertainer, natural-born scoundrel. The scoundrel part is the person, maybe who snookers people at a game of pool and steals tips from the table. But the entertainer is also bound up with that. I mean, the entertainer, he's going to tell the great joke. Just as he says, the way that he got his first job writing for the Viennese tabloids was that he marched in on the theater critic, Dr. Hans Liebstöckel, having sex with his secretary one Saturday. The story that Wilder, of course, tells us that Liebstöckel zips up his fly and says, "It's a good thing that I was working overtime today." These sorts of tales that Wilder would spin, not only in the many interviews that he gave over the course of his life and career, but also then, wove into the various scripts that he wrote and co-wrote over his multi-decade career.
Well, I think that's the mark of, to me, a great artist. Maybe not a skilled artist. Wilder was a skilled artist, but non-skilled artists, this applies to as well. We have the Tommy Wiseaus of the world, but the artists I value, you can make those connections between the personality, their history, them as people, and their work, where I think Billy Wilder... Part of what makes 1, 2, 3 to tie into this film so special for me is that it feels in a strange way for a film that is so aggro, deeply personal for Wilder. Like more than just about any of his other films, I watch it and I go, wow, what a personality. What an interesting, fascinating figure on so many levels. A lot of his films you can say that about, but for me, 1, 2, 3, what makes it maybe my favorite Wilder film is that I look at it and I feel an almost aching sincerity at the heart of all that irony. I know that Cagney, the Coca-Cola executive he's playing, has to add a little spiral toothpaste into his list of mankind's achievements for irony, but there's a real heart there that I kind of love amidst all the cynicism.
See, there you got it. You got there on your own. That's the romantic that's beneath the veneer of the cynic. I mentioned the Joseph McBride book that just came out about a year or so ago on Wilder, and he regards 1, 2, 3 as the third entry into Wilder's Berlin trilogy. You have People on Sunday, you have A Foreign Affair, and then you have 1, 2, 3, and these are among his most personal films in certain respects. Among them, those that you just mentioned. I'd add Stalag 17 to that, even though it doesn't play in Berlin. I think it's also a very, very personal film.
It's almost his, you could call it his German quadrilogy.
Yeah.
Doesn't roll off the tongue.
That doesn't quite work, does it?
I wish I'd mentioned this earlier. I might splice this earlier, is that part of what makes 1, 2, 3 so interesting as well is that it is truly one of those only could have been made in the millisecond it was made films, in that it could only have been made in 1961 and production was fully interrupted by the Berlin Wall going up. So you get the last ever scenes shot in East Germany by Americans in a movie, and it is absolutely thrilling to watch that.
Yeah, and then the rest, Devin, I mean, you're absolutely right. That is the precise historical and political backdrop of the film that I think gives it also so much more texture and also more urgency. It was finished in Munich. They had to construct then the set.
Yeah, the fake temple health.
Exactly. So it's an amazing film. If you sort of look at it specifically in that historical, political context, it's amazing. But I agree with you wholeheartedly that it is a very, very personal film for Wilder.
Well, thank you so much for coming on this show about Ernst Lubitsch to talk with me about Billy Wilder. It's been an absolute treat. I can't believe we covered this much ground in an hour and a half. It's been absolutely a treat.
Thank you. The pleasure was all mine. I really appreciate you having me, and I hope that we can have another conversation, whether it's recorded or not recorded, about Wilder, Lubitsch, and other mutual obsessions.
Likewise. Next week, Matt Severson joins us to discuss Wes Anderson and the Grand Budapest Hotel. Head over to ernstcast.com for information as to where you might find the films we'll be discussing this season and other resources such as show notes and our Discord server. How Would Lubitsch Do It is a production of Moving Image Agency. Eden Cote-Foster was our dialogue editor for this episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us on whatever podcast platform you happen to use. It helps other people find our podcast and therefore find Ernst Lubitsch. We'd like to acknowledge that this podcast was produced on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples.